Something strange happened that night behind the conductor's podium. A death that made no sound, yet left a room full of musicians paralyzed in dread. A vanished melody, a stolen name, and a murder executed with perfect timing. When silence itself becomes a weapon, it takes more than logic to hear the truth. It takes instinct, obsession, and the kind of mind that never misses a beat. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. It is not every day that civilization wobbles on its axis. But when Nero Wolfe willingly leaves the brownstone on West 35th Street and subjects himself to the perils of open air and public exposure, I don't think it's overdramatic to say the earth should register a mild tremor. That morning had started like any other. Fritz was preparing veal kidneys for lunch. The orchids were presumably thriving under Theodore's obsessive supervision, and Wolfe was ensconced in his office chair with a scowl that could wilt a cactus. Then the mail arrived. Within 2 hours, Wolfe had consented to attend a rehearsal. Not a concert, mind you, a rehearsal. My first suspicion was either poison in the beer or hypnosis. But no, it was music. Specifically, an invitation from Maestro Victor Hallberg to witness the private debut of something called The Silent Note, a long-lost masterwork, according to Hallberg's letter, recently uncovered in a Viennese attic, or perhaps a publicist's imagination. When I reminded Wolfe of his long-standing policy against venturing further than the stoop unless compelled by money, murder, or mustard sauce, he replied, "Art, Mr. Goodwin, transcends discomfort." That wasn't a no, it was an apocalypse in disguise. To understand how Hallberg got Wolfe to budge, you need to know the man's strategy was less subtle than a brass section warming up. It had started months ago. First came a case of Hungarian Takagi, followed by a crate of Stilton so pungent it had its own atmosphere. Then a Moroccan spice sampler that made Fritz weep softly into his sauté pan. Wolfe claimed he was unmoved by flattery or bribes, but I noticed he opened Hallberg's envelopes with a bit more ceremony than the electric bill. The tipping point came in the form of a leather-bound folio containing the full conductor's score to The Silent Note. Hallberg's note inside was practically a love letter to genius. "Only you, Mr. Wolfe, will grasp the structural brilliance embedded in the final cadence." Wolfe sniffed, but not dismissively. I told him the man was obviously buttering him up for something. "Indeed," Wolfe replied, "but butter is not without merit when paired with warm bread." That was his version of weakening. When Hallberg sent a second invitation, this time on parchment, I didn't need a crystal ball to see we were going out. Getting Wolfe into an overcoat is an exercise that requires leverage, guile, and possibly divine intervention. But by the time Fritz had brushed the shoulders, and I'd bribed the cabbie to idle without honking, we were somehow rolling downtown. In the cab, Wolfe sat rigid, arms folded like a stone Buddha, muttering about the criminal inefficiency of traffic systems, and how Carnegie Hall should be relocated to a less congested borough. I offered to pass the suggestion to City Hall. He ignored me. Once inside, the lobby's acoustics were overwhelmed by the sound of egos colliding. Hallberg's people had set up a private reception with just enough canapes to keep Wolfe from turning back. He sniffed them, declined, and allowed himself to be ushered into the front row of the rehearsal chamber. The place smelled like polished wood, old paper, and fear, the usual combination when musicians are expected to perform something no one's ever heard before, including themselves. Backstage was a zoo where the animals wore tuxedos and tuned nervously. I've seen more relaxed interrogation rooms. I did the rounds while Wolfe anchored himself in a chair like it owed him rent. The concertmaster, a rigid character named Ernst Brodel, met me with a stare so dry it could flake paint. When I asked how rehearsal was going, he offered a single syllable. "Adequate." I pressed. He blinked. End of conversation. Then came Ingrid Messner, second violinist, and, apparently, unofficial morale manager. She fluttered like a hummingbird hopped up on espresso, smiling too brightly and calling the score genius, with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't read it all the way through. "And where's the flutist?" I asked. "Oh, Ernesto. He's around," she chirped. "Always just stepped out." Funny. For a guy who was always stepping out, no one seemed to know where he was stepping to. I made a note of that. Wolfe, meanwhile, had turned his attention fully to the stage. His eyes had that slightly glazed, inward look he usually reserved for food or orchids in peak bloom. If the music was as mysterious as the mood backstage, we were in for something strange. They began with a warm-up, tuning and fiddling like the instruments were unsure of each other. Then came the first real notes of the silent note. From the first bar, Wolfe didn't move. Not a blink, not a twitch. I've seen him show more reaction to a change in beer temperature. But I knew that stillness. It meant the gears were grinding somewhere inside that oversized head. Hallberg conducted like a man possessed. He leaned into the crescendos, shaped the rests with trembling fingers, and practically whispered to the strings. The music itself was haunting, plaintive, then jarring, then hypnotic. I didn't know a bar from a bracket, but even I could tell the final section was different. Off, maybe, too quiet. Hallberg reached the last page and suddenly went stiff. For a beat too long, he didn't move. Wolfe shifted, barely, but to me, it was like hearing a church bell in a library. Then the last note hit, and something snapped. Hallberg didn't collapse so much as disintegrate. 1 second, he was coaxing music from the air with both arms raised. The next, he dropped like a marionette whose strings had all been cut at once. The orchestra froze. The silence that followed was jagged, unnatural. Then came the sounds, gasps, scattered instruments clattering to the floor, and someone's coffee mug shattering backstage. I bolted forward, but Wolfe beat me by a full half step, which for him is basically teleportation. He bent over Hallberg, muttered, "He's dead," and backed off, as if death were contagious. The medics arrived late enough to make it tragic, but early enough to ensure we didn't get out of there before the scene became chaos. Wolfe submitted to being questioned, barely. I offered my name and credentials, which earned me a look from the attending officer like I'd handed him a crossword puzzle. We were free to go, eventually, but not free of it. Back in the cab, Wolfe said only one thing before clamming up entirely. "The silence," he murmured, "was misused." It wasn't his usual brand of cryptic, which, coming from Wolfe, meant we were already neck-deep in something someone didn't want heard. It took the Philharmonic a full 24 hours to decide that Victor Hallberg had been killed by what the papers called a sudden catastrophic cardiac event, which is a lot of syllables to say his heart quit without notice. I got the official version from Ernst Brodel, the concertmaster with the personality of a broken metronome. When I dropped by his office, he barely glanced up from a stack of music sheets. "Victor was a fragile man," he said, in the tone of someone discussing a misplaced umbrella. "He had stress, blood pressure, and, how do you say, too much wine?" "Yeah," I said, "and probably too many enemies." That got me a raised eyebrow, which from Brodel was equivalent to a roundhouse punch. Back at the brownstone, I reported in. Wolfe was in his chair, a bottle of Lowenbräu in reach, and a look of suffering on his face. "He's suggesting Hallberg died of overexertion?" Wolfe asked. "Brodel says it was natural causes." "Phooey," Wolfe said without looking up. "So is indigestion. Yet neither is timed to the final measure of a symphonic premiere." He reached for the beer with slow precision. "I abhor coincidence, and you, Archie, may now begin." 3 hours later, just as Fritz was preparing to lay out the duck galantine, the bell rang. Wolfe scowled, since anything arriving after lunch and before beer was considered a war crime. I answered the door and beheld Margareta Hallberg, widow, former mezzo-soprano, current whirlwind in widow's black. She swept in like she was entering Act 2 of Tosca, trailing perfume, velvet, and disdain. "I must speak with Mr. Wolfe," she announced, eyes scanning the room like it was auditioning for judgment. Wolfe, who despises melodrama unless it comes from Puccini, offered a grudging nod. "I assume," he said, This pertains to your husband's sudden expiration. It pertains to his murder, she replied flatly, removing her gloves with the delicacy of someone skinning a liar. That got Wolfe's attention, though he hid it under an eyebrow. She sat. Fritz brought her coffee, which she ignored. Her gaze went straight to Wolfe's. Victor was not a healthy man, she said. But he was not that unhealthy. He died in front of a full orchestra, playing a score no one was supposed to see. You think that's chance? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Mine widened. Things were warming up, and not just because Fritz had turned up the radiators. She reached into her handbag and produced a neatly folded folio. Even from across the room, I could see the aged paper, the tidy notation, and the faint smear near the edge. This, she said, laying it out, is the score Victor brought home 2 weeks ago, not the one used at the rehearsal. Wolfe leaned forward, not a lot, just enough to suggest that gravity had been briefly overridden by interest. She flipped to the final page. In the lower margin, scribbled in pencil, were 5 small words. It ends without breath. Victor wrote that the night before he died, she said. I read the words again. It wasn't poetry. It was a warning, or a confession, or maybe both. Wolfe stared at the page for a long moment. Then he sank back into his chair with the air of a man who'd just seen a ghost, and thought it looked familiar. I've seen grieving widows cry, scream, faint, and once throw a sandwich. Margareta Hallberg did none of the above. She gave us names. Ernst Brodel, she said, concertmaster, arrogant, humourless, and spiteful. Victor often said he played with the soul of a file cabinet. Wolfe gave a slight incline of the head. Indeed. Pavel Struner, she continued, a rival conductor, ruthless, charming in public, vicious in private. He wanted the silent note, and Victor knew it. I took notes, while Fritz, clearly eavesdropping from the hallway, paused just long enough to drop a tea tray and shuffle off like a ninja in slippers. And Chester Barr, she said last. Victor's agent, a man with no morals, 2 phones, and at least 1 offshore account. Motives? Wolfe asked. Ambition, she replied. Revenge. Money. Pick one. She didn't blink. Neither did Wolfe. I assume, he said slowly, you intend to retain my services. Her smile was faint, controlled. I intend to uncover the truth, she said, whether it's buried in the music or in someone's pocket. Wolfe grunted, which, in his dialect, was the verbal equivalent of leaning forward with interest. Wolfe stared at the final page of the score like it had just insulted his ancestry. He let out a sigh that had the weight of culture and cholesterol. There are few crimes more vulgar, he said, than the silencing of genius. Margareta lifted an eyebrow, but wisely didn't interrupt. He tapped the page. If this was written by Victor Hallberg, then it contains his swan song. If not, it is the work of a thief. Either way, it is the instrument of murder. I glanced at the clock. Fritz would not be pleased. Wolfe leaned back. Very well. I shall accept the case. Mr. Goodwin will investigate. I will contemplate. Margareta nodded once, rose, and glided out like a woman who just dropped a match and didn't care where it landed. Fritz entered silently and stared at the untouched lunch. Wolfe gave him a look. Postpone it. That was when I knew it was serious. The door clicked shut behind Margareta, and Wolfe immediately turned to Fritz and said, The duck is to be preserved for tomorrow. The sauce, not reheated. Yes, sir, Fritz said, with the wounded dignity of a man whose efforts had been deflated by murder. Wolfe swiveled toward me. Archie, I require the following. A list of all current Philharmonic members, both permanent and rotating. Also, programs from the past 5 seasons. And the background on Mr. Struner and Mr. Barr. Yes, sir, I said, mimicking his tone. Spare me your mockery, he said. Also, visit the music library at Juilliard. Request anything on Viennese chamber works dated between 1900 and 1935. I raised a brow. Planning to compose something of your own? He didn't rise to it. He was too deep in the weeds. I must determine, he said slowly, whether the silent note is a fraud, a forgery, or a funeral march. I grabbed my coat and headed out. Fritz gave me a mournful glance as I passed the kitchen. I gave him a shrug. In Wolfe's world, you don't argue with genius, especially when it's gone quiet at just the wrong moment. And I had a feeling that silence had a body count. I've had drinks with jazz drummers, card games with pickpockets, and lunch with a guy who once ran an illegal ferret ring in Queens, and none of them oozed the kind of slippery charm that Pavel Struner delivered across his shiny glass-topped desk. The Philharmonic had kindly arranged a 10-minute window for me to speak to the great man himself. I used 9 of those minutes watching him polish a fingernail with a silk pocket square. I was very fond of Victor, he said finally, in the kind of accent that could sell expensive razors. A tragic loss. Of course, he was also unstable. Unstable how? I asked, aiming for casual and landing closer to surgical. Struner lifted a shoulder. He believed things, conspiracies, enemies. He was paranoid about the silent note, said someone wanted to steal it. I gave him a look. He smiled. You think I'd kill for music, Mr. Goodwin? I think I've seen people kill for far less. He chuckled, which somehow made him more dangerous, not less. As I left, he called after me. Tell Mr. Wolfe I'd love to debate him on the work structure, assuming he can read Hungarian notation. I didn't answer. I already needed aspirin. If Struner was a diamond cutter's version of charm, Ingrid Messner was spun glass held together by tension and caffeine. I found her in the practice lounge, working a Vivaldi solo with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb. She paused when I introduced myself and tilted her head like she was trying to tune me. Victor didn't trust many people, she said quietly, especially not near the end. What was he afraid of? I asked. She lowered her bow. Exposure. I don't mean scandal. I mean truth. He said the silent note wasn't what everyone thought it was, that if he played it publicly, it would ruin someone. He never told me who. Did he seem scared? She nodded, but determined. He said the music would speak louder than words ever could. That would have been poetic, if he hadn't dropped dead on the downbeat. Before I could ask more, Broddle appeared in the doorway and gave me a glare that could chip paint. Ingrid whispered, "Be careful, Mr. Goodwin." Victor wasn't wrong to be afraid. I left with the feeling that someone in that building was playing a tune only Wolfe could hear, and we were still just warming up. Ernesto Volpe, the Philharmonic's principal flutist, had pulled the kind of vanishing act that usually involves passport stamps and a poor grasp of extradition law. Every time I asked about him, I got the same shrug and the same line. He's not in today. Nobody knew where he lived, what hotel he used, or whether he preferred Bach or bourbon. I did manage to corner a second clarinet in the hallway, a guy named Denny with a moustache too ambitious for his lip. "Ernesto," he said. "Yeah, he left right after the rehearsal. Told me the piece gave him the chills." "Musically or medically?" Denny blinked. "I think both." I passed that nugget to Wolfe over the phone. "If you were a flutist," he said, "and you heard something at rehearsal that no one else acknowledged, what would you do? Check my sanity. Or your health." That was Wolfe's way of saying we needed Saul Panzer, and we needed him now. And when Wolfe puts Panzer in play, it's because things are no longer just curious. They're dangerous. Returning to the brownstone, I expected a normal post-inquiry atmosphere. Wolfe in his chair, Fritz humming in the kitchen, and the orchids basking in their artificially pampered glory. What I found instead was Wolfe standing, yes, standing, in the hallway outside the orchid rooms, looking like someone had dared to critique Puccini in his presence. The door to the plant room was ajar. Theodore was flapping around inside like a bird with a broken wing, muttering botanical curses. "What the hell happened?" I asked. "They were touched," Wolfe growled. Some of them moved. Moved? I looked at the orchids. They seemed their usual smug selves. I did not authorize it, neither did Theodore. Therefore, someone has entered without permission. The words entered and orchid room in Wolfe's sentence rarely cohabitated, unless followed by the word never. Fritz poked his head in, pale. I thought I heard something during lunch. Footsteps upstairs. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Nothing appears missing, he said. But appearances, Mr. Goodwin, are deceit's favourite disguise. I was already heading to the office to check the files. And the safe. The first thing I checked was Wolfe's locked drawer in the office, the one reserved for documents so precious even Fritz wasn't allowed to dust around them. The key turned with a satisfying click. The drawer opened with a very unsatisfying absence. The score, the annotated copy of the silent note that Victor Hallberg himself had mailed us, was gone. I double-checked. Wolfe triple-checked. Fritz turned a shade of white usually reserved for salt. I didn't even know it was there, he whispered, genuinely rattled. Then you're innocent, I said. Wolfe doesn't let you near his holy texts. Wolfe stood perfectly still for a moment. Then he exhaled once, sharply. That someone entered this house without detection and removed a single item of precise value, he said, suggests a familiarity I find intolerable. He looked at me. Find Ernesto Volpe. Immediately. And just like that, the direction of the case changed keys, from curiosity to alarm. It took Saul Panzer under 3 hours to track down Ernesto Volpe, which was either a testament to Saul's skills or Ernesto's amateur-level vanishing. He was holed up in a dusty motel off 8th Avenue, 2 blocks from a piano bar and 1 block from what used to be a bakery and was now something involving kale. Saul got him to open the door, barely. I stepped in, smiled, and was hit with a wave of unshaven paranoia and menthol. You got the wrong guy, he muttered, eyes darting. Sure, but I'm sticking with you anyway. I eased him onto the stained armchair. I heard something, he said, shaking, during the rehearsal, right before Victor collapsed. What? He looked up, terrified. I don't know, but it wasn't in the score. Before I could ask more, he stood up. I shouldn't have come, he whispered. They're watching. Who's watching? But he was already shoving his few belongings into a backpack. Saul tried to stop him. Didn't matter. Ernesto was gone again, and I had the sinking feeling this was going to be the last time we'd see him in motion. By the time Saul and I got back to the motel later that night, room 212 was dark, empty, and very much paid up. The manager, a guy with more nose hair than policy, said Ernesto had checked out 20 minutes earlier, paid in cash, no forwarding address, no taxi. Panzer searched the alley. I checked the fire escape. Nothing but a pigeon and some leftover lo mein. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't rise when I gave him the news. He just closed his eyes. He's gone, I said. And I don't think it's just stage fright this time. No, Wolfe murmured. He fled because he heard something he shouldn't have. He opened his eyes and fixed them on me. Now we must determine whether he will resurface or float. That was Wolfe's version of a prayer, and I didn't like the sound of it at all. When Saul Panzer called at 7:43 a.m. and used the word floater, I knew I wouldn't be finishing my coffee hot. Ernesto Volpe, former flutist and current corpse, had made his final public appearance bobbing face down in the East River, tethered to a cinder block with a metronome. Symbolic, sure, but not subtle. I got to the scene before Wolfe did, not because he was coming, but because he wasn't. When a body's in the water, Wolfe stays dry. The uniforms had cordoned off the area, but one of them recognized me, probably from the last dozen times I'd shown up somewhere a corpse had recently clocked out. I gave them my best smile and my ID. Volpe was still recognizable, which didn't help. The eyes were open, and the expression said he'd heard something real bad right before the final note. One detective muttered it looked like suicide. I muttered something anatomically unlikely. The tide may have brought him back in. but I had the feeling Wolfe hadn't left by choice. The orchestra had lost its flutist, and Wolfe had just lost the one guy who might have told us what he heard, and why it killed him. Kramer barreled into the brownstone just past 10, tracking city dirt and fury across Fritz's freshly polished floor. I met him at the door, but it didn't help. "You happy now?" he barked. "Dead guy number 2 shows up, and you two aren't even pretending it's coincidence." "I never said it was coincidence," I offered. "Wolfe thinks it's orchestration." Kramer shouldered past me and stormed into the office. Wolfe didn't rise. He rarely does, especially when he has the moral high ground, which he assumed came built into his chair. "Ernesto Wolfe," Kramer snapped. "Found in the river, 1 metronome, 0 explanations, and your name is already in the reports. Again." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "I presume you came to ask whether I drowned the man in a fit of musical critique." Kramer glared. "I came because your fingerprints may not be on the corpse, but they're always on the case. I want to know what you know, now." Wolfe sipped his beer with infuriating calm. "When I know something worth your attention, Inspector, I shall ring a bell." He didn't mention that he'd already started ringing it, mentally. Luck, as I've mentioned once or twice, is mostly sweat with a bow tie. This time it came in the form of a lazy officer named McGinty and an evidence box that hadn't made it to headquarters yet. I intercepted Ernesto's effects under the pretense of assisting the family. The family didn't know he was dead yet, but McGinty didn't ask for ID. Bless him. Back at the brownstone, I laid out the contents of Ernesto's suitcase like they were rare artifacts. A half-eaten granola bar, 2 shirts, a wrinkled music program, and a handheld tape recorder. Wolfe, who usually disdains anything battery-powered, gave a single nod. I pressed play. What came out was hiss, static, and then something. A faint whisper. It didn't sound like Ernesto. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. "The note was never meant to be heard," the voice said, crackling through the speakers. Then silence. Wolfe didn't move. He simply said, "Again." I hit rewind. I listened to it 6 times. Wolfe listened to it 20. By the 3rd pass, I had goosebumps. By the 6th, Wolfe's eyes had gone glassy, and I knew he was already peeling back layers I couldn't see. Wolfe listened to that whisper like it was an ancient riddle recited in Latin, backward, by a ghost with good diction. Each time it played, he tilted his head slightly to one side, as if aligning an invisible mental gear. After the 7th loop, he grunted. Wolfe's equivalent of a minor earthquake. "That voice," he said, "too distorted for identification, yet the phrasing, deliberate." He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The note was never meant to be heard. A confession, a warning, or a code. "Or all 3, I offered. He opened one eye. "Your levity is ill-timed, Mr. Goodwin." I took that as a compliment. He gestured toward the recorder. "Bring Theodore." "Theodore?" I raised a brow. "He's not a music expert." "No, but I require silence, precise silence." "Ah," I said. "You're going to the orchids." "Correct. And while I am there, you will not enter, nor will Fritz, nor the mail." The orchids were about to become the stage for Wolfe's next act, and if past experience was anything to go by, something was about to bloom besides the flowers. If you've never seen Wolfe lock himself in the orchid rooms, let me paint the picture. Imagine a monk with a grudge, a botanist's ego, and a vendetta against ignorance. By noon, the brownstone was under siege by silence. Wolfe had issued a full moratorium on entry to the plant rooms. Theodore was sulking in the kitchen. Fritz was muttering to himself about great men with bad timing, and I was stuck listening to the same damn whisper on repeat, hoping it would suddenly become fluent in confessions. Wolfe emerged around 3:15 with a flush to his cheeks, and that rare sparkle in his eyes that meant he'd either had an epiphany or discovered a new species of orchid. "I require the score," he said. "You mean the one someone stole?" I replied. "Indeed, but we shall proceed without it. Fetch me paper. Ruled." That was Wolfe's version of going to war. He began, sketching out staves, pauses, dynamics, treating the phrase, "never meant to be heard," like it had been written in musical notation. He wasn't looking for a message. He was deciphering a composition, and whoever had written it was about to get played. Kramer came back that evening, chewing an unlit cigar like it owed him money. "It's a suicide," he declared, tossing a folder onto Wolfe's desk. The guy was spiraling. Hotel receipts, erratic behavior. Witness says he kept muttering about invisible sounds. "He wasn't unstable," I said. "He was scared." "Same thing, Goodwin." Wolfe, who'd been reviewing the recorder again, set it down gently and steepled his fingers. "Inspector," he said, "to presume Volpe committed suicide is an error, both factual and aesthetic." Kramer grunted. "You calling me stupid?" "I am saying," Wolfe replied, "that to ascribe the action to suicide is to ignore its orchestration. The weighted metronome was not symbolic. It was mockery." Kramer's lip curled. "You saying someone murdered a flutist with musical irony?" "Precisely." Kramer barked a laugh. "Got a suspect?" "Not yet. But the killer," Wolfe said, "is a musician. That much is incontrovertible." "And what makes you so sure?" Wolfe smiled faintly. "Because only a musician understands how to make silence sing." Kramer didn't like it. Neither did I, because that meant the killer still had perfect pitch. And another performance coming. You know things are getting lively when gossip starts flowing from cellists. According to my source at the Philharmonic, a man who played second cello and first fiddle in the orchestra's rumour mill, Victor Hallberg hadn't composed the silent note so much as resurrected it. The original, supposedly, came from one Andor Lakatos, a Hungarian composer who died in the 1930s under what my informant called Gothic circumstances, which probably meant tuberculosis and bad lighting. Lakatos had vanished into obscurity with a pile of unpublished scores, including one referred to in a diary entry as the piece that cannot end. Naturally, when the silent note surfaced under Hallberg's name, some folks thought it was divine rediscovery. Others, including a music professor with a grudge and a blog, were less reverent. They whispered the big man had lifted Lakatos's work note for note and slapped his name on it. That kind of theft wasn't just artistic, it was reputational. It also meant that the silent note at the end of the piece might have been more than musical. I passed it all to Wolfe. "Interesting," he said, without looking up from the manuscript. "Ghosts seldom sue, but their heirs do." I returned to the Philharmonic, not because I liked the wallpaper or the company, but because Pavel Struner was reportedly in a talkative mood, and when smug men start talking, you bring a sponge to catch what leaks. He greeted me with a smile that had more angles than honesty. "Ah, Mr. Goodwin," he said, "come to ask about the skeleton in Hallberg's manuscript. You seem eager to talk." "Not eager. Relieved." He leaned back. "Some of us knew Victor didn't write that piece. It wasn't his voice. It was someone else's. Long gone." "You mean Lakatos?" He nodded. "Andor Lakatos, a genius, forgotten, until Victor decided to exhume him." "Any evidence?" Struner tapped his temple. "You don't need evidence when your ears know the difference." He paused. Victor was a coward. He could have credited Lakatos. He didn't, and now he's paid. I didn't like the way he said that, like fate had settled a tab and left a generous tip. If it was coincidence, it had timing. If it wasn't, well, Struner knew a lot for someone still holding a baton, and I was ready to pull it from his hand. Back at the brownstone, I laid it all out for Margareta Hallberg: composer theft, ghost authorship, Hungarian drama, and enough professional jealousy to stuff a concert hall. She listened with the detached elegance of someone who's been accused of worse and survived. "That's absurd," she said. "Victor would rather set fire to a symphony than steal one. Some folks say he borrowed heavily from Lakatos." She waved her hand. "Borrowed, a theme here or there maybe, but the structure, the depth, that was Victor." Wolfe, observing from his chair, said, "You are certain?" She turned to him. "Certain?" "No. But I knew Victor. If he had stolen it, he would have confessed, dramatically, probably on stage." "That," Wolfe murmured, "is exactly what he tried to do." Margareta blinked. "What do you mean?" He closed his eyes. "Nothing yet." She bristled like a soprano losing her solo, but said nothing more. When she left, Wolfe sat back with a sigh. "She is loyal," he said, "possibly too loyal. But then, so are the dead, and that has never stopped them from being exploited." I cornered Chester Barr, Victor's agent, in his office, where the decor screamed tax shelter and the lighting was the colour of guilt. Barr was a soft-spoken man with the shoulders of someone who avoided confrontation and the haircut of someone who paid others to lie for him. "I don't know where this Lakatos nonsense started," he said, crossing his legs like he was folding laundry. "Probably some bitter composer who never made it past his own rehearsal room." "Was there a lawsuit?" I asked. He blinked. "That hasn't been made public." "Was there a lawsuit?" I repeated, slow and polite. He folded. "Fine. Yes, there was an inquiry from a legal firm in Vienna, someone claiming rights to the Lakatos estate. They alleged that Hallberg's score matched one held in a private archive. Why didn't it surface? I paid them to go away," Barr said. "Victor panicked, but I told him we'd delay, settle, and nobody would notice. And then he wanted to come clean. He said he was going to make an announcement at the premiere." I stood, which is exactly when he died. Barr didn't reply. He just looked like a man who knew the curtain had dropped, and he hadn't rehearsed his next line. Barr, now looking like a man watching his investment portfolio catch fire, opened a locked drawer and handed me a copy of the silent note, Victor's private version, not the one from the rehearsal. "This one's different," he muttered. "Victor edited the final measure 2 weeks before the performance." "How different?" "He changed the rhythm, extended the rest at the end. He said it had to be exact. It was the only way." "The only way for what?" Barr shrugged. "To tell the truth without being sued, I guess. Or maybe to confess." I examined the last bar. It wasn't a rest. It was a double fermata, 2 full stops, exaggerated beyond standard notation. Wolfe would have called it melodrama. I called it suspicious. When I brought the copy back to the brownstone, Wolfe laid it beside his notes and stared at it like a jeweller assessing a forgery. "He tried to code it," he said. "In the structure, in the silence." "Code what?" "The fact that the music was not his, that it was borrowed, stolen." He tapped the page. "This is not composition, it is confession." And somewhere, I had the sinking feeling the killer had heard it loud and clear. That evening, Wolfe sat in his chair with the kind of silence that usually preceded either a declaration or a demand. I brought him his beer and stayed quiet. Finally, he spoke. "Hallberg was not murdered out of rivalry, Archie, nor greed, not in the ordinary sense." "Then what?" He took a sip. "Fear." He let the word hang in the room like a badly played chord. Whoever killed him was not threatened by Victor's success, but by what Victor would say, or reveal. The music was secondary. It was the message behind it that frightened them. And what was the message? That the truth, Wolfe said, was written into the silence. He closed his eyes. Ernesto Volpe heard something. So did Victor. One of them is dead, the other is missing. And the score. He opened his eyes again. Was altered not for beauty, but for survival. I didn't say anything. I just watched Wolfe settle deeper into his chair. He was warming up. And when Wolfe warms up, someone else is usually about to get cold. Tuesday morning, 9:42 a.m., I received a call from Lieutenant Rowcliffe, which meant 2 things. Something unpleasant had happened, and he was hoping Wolfe didn't know about it yet. "Archives room," he said. "Philharmonic headquarters. You'll want to see it. That's the kind of invitation you don't decline." I headed down and got there just in time to see the morgue boys zip Chester Bar into something that wasn't Italian wool. The room smelled like old paper, varnish, and trouble. The body was slumped between two shelving cabinets, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as if he'd heard one last terrible solo before lights out. And then there was the baton. It had been driven into his throat at a clean vertical angle, the handle still sticking out like some sick joke. I'd seen Wolfe slice into a suckling pig with less precision. Kramer hadn't arrived yet, which gave me time to observe the look on Rowcliffe's face, somewhere between confusion and trying not to throw up. "Who found him?" I asked. "Secretary. Said he was supposed to sign off on a press release." "Looks like someone signed him off first," I muttered. And this time, the killer hadn't bothered with silence. Kramer arrived 20 minutes later, trenchcoat flapping, tie askew, and his expression doing the work of 4 expletives. He barked at Rowcliffe, waved me off like a fruit fly, and stood over Chester Bar's body with his arms crossed. "Another stiff in your orbit, Goodwin." "Don't blame me," I said. "Blame the orchestra. They're really committing to this theme." He grunted and turned toward me. "I suppose you'll tell me Wolfe predicted this too, that he saw it in the sheet music, or the way Barr held a pen." "I won't tell you anything. You'll hear it from him." "I'll hear operatic nonsense and dietary complaints," he snapped. "Meanwhile, we've got 2 bodies in 2 days, both tied to the same damn score. That's a chorus, not a coincidence." Kramer glared. "You think this is cute? A guy gets a baton rammed down his throat, and you want to play conductor?" "No," I said. "I want to know who's writing the music." He didn't respond, just stared at the baton. Barr hadn't sung, but someone had shut him up in the most literal way possible, and I had a feeling Wolfe was already rewriting the libretto. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was seated in his armchair with the serene focus of a man orchestrating empires. I delivered the news with the same calm you might use to mention someone had accidentally set fire to the Guggenheim. He didn't flinch. "A baton?" he asked. "Down the throat. Barr won't be doing any more speaking engagements." Wolfe sipped his beer. "Not music then, not envy. Fraud." I tilted my head. "You've said that before." And I meant it. This is not about rivalry. It is about ownership, identity. He turned his eyes toward me. "Hallberg's score, real or forged, represented value. Cultural, historical, and above all, monetary. That value was about to be contested. And now the contesters are being removed." I nodded. Neatly. "No," Wolfe said. "Brutally. Which suggests urgency, or panic. Or both." Wolfe reached for the envelope from Vienna, the one with the Lakatos letter we'd copied from Barr's desk. "Find out who benefits most from the authenticity of the silent note. If it's worth killing for, someone's already spent the profits in their head." He closed his eyes. "And hurry. We're not the only ones keeping time." I made an appointment with the Philharmonic's finance manager, a sleek operator named Oliver Kintner, who wore tortoiseshell glasses and a cologne that cost more than my watch. He ushered me into a corner office decorated in mahogany and misplaced priorities. "I assume this is about Victor Hallberg," he said, folding his hands like they'd just returned from a board meeting. "Among others," I replied. "You signed off on promotional funds for the silent note." He nodded. "It was projected to generate 7 figures in direct sponsorship and international rights, not to mention the legacy value. And if it turned out Hallberg didn't actually compose it," he stiffened, "that would be problematic." "Financially or legally?" "Both," he admitted. "We've already licensed the piece to 4 European houses. If the work turns out to be plagiarized, we're liable for breach of contract." "How liable?" "Deep 6 figures, and reputationally, worse." "Were you aware of any claims against Hallberg?" He hesitated. "There were whispers, a letter or 2. Barr handled it. And now Barr's been handled himself." Kintner adjusted his tie. "We believed the matter was closed." "Closed," I said, rising, "isn't the word I'd use. More like choked off. Saul Panzer never knocks twice. When he walked into the office at 4:15 sharp, his expression told me he'd either found the killer or an excellent pastrami sandwich. Possibly both. I tracked down a guy named Fabian Horvath, he said. Retired musicologist, used to lecture in Vienna. Now lives in Queens with a dog named Ravel. Sounds stable. He had this. Saul produced an envelope aged to perfection. Inside was a brittle letter, handwritten in Hungarian, with an English translation clipped to it. I read it aloud. To whoever attempts to finish my final work, beware. It is cursed. Its silence is final. Those who attempt to perform it will not reach its end. Signed, Andor Lakatos. Wolfe tapped a finger against his temple. A dramatist's flourish, but telling. Do you believe in curses, sir? I asked. No, Wolfe said, but I believe in timing. Lakatos knew the piece was dangerous, not supernaturally, but personally. It held something worth killing for? Or dying for, he said. As Hallberg did. I glanced at Saul and Ernesto. Wolfe didn't respond. He didn't have to. The letter had written its own footnote, and it smelled like blood. Back in the office, I handed Wolfe the letter again. He read it once, then folded it neatly and tucked it beside the score as if it belonged there. Still think it's all superstition? I asked. Yes, he said, but that does not mean it's irrelevant. You mean the killer believes it? Possibly, or they want us to believe it, which, as motivations go, is even more insidious. He leaned back and tapped his chin. A musical score that carries death with its final bar. A conductor, a flutist, and an agent, all silenced. And now, a retired musicologist issuing posthumous warnings. It's not a curse, I said. It's a chain reaction. Precisely. He stood, no small event, and walked to the window. We must find the fulcrum, the moment it shifted from performance to peril. That might be the score itself. Then let it be examined, but not by a musician. I raised an eyebrow. Then by who? A physicist, he said, turning to me, or an engineer. That made me blink. Wolfe was no longer sniffing after forgeries. He was looking for a mechanism, and whoever built it had timed the kill to perfection. The envelope was tucked between the pages of Hallberg's copy of the silent note, as if some helpful spirit had decided to file it under motives for murder. No return address, no signature, just a typewritten message that read, "You stole from the dead, now wait your turn." And below that, 3 measures of music, all rests, no notes, like a death threat composed by a minimalist. Someone's feeling lyrical, I muttered. Wolfe, back in his chair and orbiting around his 9th beer of the day, didn't so much as twitch. You found it where? In the margin of Hallberg's marked score. Hidden, but not shy. Wolfe opened his eyes just enough to glance toward me. Anonymous threats are the currency of cowards. This one, however, has rhythm. I nodded. 4/4 time. It's a pity your intellectual resources don't extend to musical notation. I make up for it with charm, I said. He grunted. But that letter was no joke. Hallberg had been warned. The question was, did he take it seriously before someone decided to end his performance entirely? There's something intimate about a typewriter's mistakes, like recognizing someone by the way they always spill coffee on page 3. This particular threat had a distinctive limp on the lowercase e, just enough of a tilt to make it look like it was embarrassed to be there. So I did what any enterprising assistant sleuth would do. I paid a little visit to the Philharmonic's copy room. It was the kind of place that smelled like dry paper and wet resentment. 2 desks, 3 filing cabinets, and 1 vintage Remington typewriter parked like it had tenure. I pulled a sheet, tapped out a few test lines, and sure enough, our crooked E was singing off key. A guy named Denny, who manned the room like a bored toll booth attendant, confirmed it. Yeah, people come in here to type up corrections and program notes. Sheet music edits too. People meaning who? I asked. He shrugged. Mostly Ingrid. Sometimes Lyle Dunn. No one else bothers. I didn't say anything, but my gut started doing drum rolls. Whoever had pounded out that threat did it right here, just a few feet from a Xerox machine and a stack of blank staves. Ingrid Olsberg looked like a Scandinavian glacier had taken up the violin. Thin, blonde, eyes sharp enough to Julian a carrot, and a mouth set in permanent mezzo forte disapproval. She was the kind of woman who wouldn't flinch if the building collapsed, as long as the concertmaster bowed properly on the way down. When I asked about the typewriter, she didn't blink. Yes, I've used it, she said, to make annotations. It's temperamental, but functional. Like most artists, I offered. Ever type out a threatening note to Hallberg? She narrowed those eyes at me. I don't traffic in juvenile gestures. If I had something to say to Victor, I said it face to face. That left Lyle Dunn, a percussionist with the emotional subtlety of a kettle drum and a chin that could punch back. I caught him in rehearsal, thwacking a snare with the enthusiasm of a man taking out marital issues on a salad bowl. Yeah, I used the typewriter, he admitted. Typed out a few requests for new scores. Big deal. Big enough if you used it for something else, I said. He looked at me. What are you accusing me of? Not yet. But don't worry, you'll hear the cue when it comes. Lyle Dunn didn't have the face of a liar. He had the face of a man who drank coffee straight from the pot and insulted metronomes for being slow. When I asked him if Hallberg fired him, he didn't deny it. He said I soured the tempo, Lyle muttered. Said I made the music feel like it had arthritis. Did you? I asked. He shrugged. I hit the rhythm how I heard it. Maybe it wasn't to his taste. Doesn't make me a murderer. No, but it gives you a motive with a metronome attached. Lyle scowled. I respected Hallberg, but he didn't respect me. He canned me a week ago. No notice. Just, thanks, goodbye, don't forget your triangle. I gave him a nod. Sure, and you handled that with the composure of a Buddhist monk. I handled it how a drummer handles silence, he said, by filling it. Cute line. But I'd seen enough of Lyle to know the only thing he could orchestrate was a shouting match at a loading dock. Still, Hallberg had enemies. One of them, somewhere, had turned silence into something fatal. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe treating Fritz's lamb stew with the same level of appreciation he usually reserved for subpoena threats. In other words, he was ignoring it completely. He sat in the office, brow creased, staring at the final page of the silent note like it had slipped him a vulgar insult. His lips were pressed together, not in thought. Wolfe doesn't think, he dissects, but in something bordering on irritation. You'll spoil your appetite, I warned. My appetite, he replied without moving, is irrelevant at present. Shall I have Fritz file a missing persons report? He grunted. I leaned over to glimpse the page. Looks like just another mess of dots and lines to me. Then be grateful your auditory limitations spared you from ever attempting music, he said. Touché. Whatever Wolfe had found in those measures, it had him frozen in place. And when he stops speaking and starts brooding, I know one thing. Something is about to break. You'd think a piece called The Silent Note would have the decency to live up to its name. But no. Right at the end of Hallberg's score sat a double fermata. Two curved crescents perched like vultures above a final rest. I'm no musicologist, but I knew enough to know that meant pause, hold, linger. Wolfe, still seated, spoke like a man narrating a eulogy for a corpse that wouldn't lie still. Silence, he said, is not nothingness, Archie. It is the space in which one may hear most clearly. Poetic, I said. But unless that fermata came with a revolver, I don't see the connection. He didn't answer, just tapped the desk twice with his index finger and leaned back, fingers steepled. It wasn't just a musical pause. Wolfe believed Hallberg had buried a signal in that silence, and if that was true, then whatever the conductor heard during that held breath had gotten him killed. I'd been chewing on Ernesto Volpe's dying message like a stale biscotti. "I didn't hear anything," he'd whispered, shaking like a bass string in a thunderstorm. But Wolfe's theory, about the fermata hiding more than a breath, put it all in tune. Ernesto hadn't meant silence in the literal sense. He meant the opposite. He'd heard too much during that pause. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. A whisper in the wings. A scuffle. A second breath in a room meant for one. Whatever he heard during that final fermata had turned his nerves into soup. And if Wolfe was right, it wasn't just fear of music. It was fear of what came with it. I jotted it all in my notebook, then looked up at Wolfe. "You think that note got him killed?" "No," Wolfe said. "I think what came after it did." And just like that, we were one bar closer to the finale, and the murderer's curtain call. At 4:02 sharp, I ushered in the suspects like a maitre d' at a cursed dinner party. They entered Wolfe's office one by one. Ingrid Olsberg in a beige trench coat too stiff to wrinkle. Chester Barr chewing invisible gum. Lyle Dunn looking like he'd rather be anywhere but near an armchair. And Denny the copy room guy who thought punctuation was a personal attack. Wolfe hadn't moved from his throne behind the desk. He gave the briefest of nods and said, "Gentlemen, Miss Olsberg, sit." They sat. No one got comfortable. "Archie," he said, "you will see that Fritz prepares the overture." That meant one thing. Not soup. Drama. I went to the kitchen and passed the message along. Fritz raised one eyebrow and wiped his hands on his apron like he was being drafted into war. "Will there be blood?" he asked. "Only if someone confesses to it," I said. Back in the office, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. Wolfe adjusted his cuffs. "We shall now reconstruct the murder," he said calmly. "In 3 movements. Do try to remain in tune." Lyle cracked his knuckles. Someone would crack more than that before this was over. Fritz entered with the flair of a man who could slice onions to a metronome. In one hand, he held a folded conductor's baton. In the other, Hallberg's annotated score of The Silent Note. I followed him, carrying a music stand and a look that said I hadn't signed up for Broadway matinees. Wolfe gestured grandly. "The stand there. Mr. Goodwin, if you please, page turner." "Yes, maestro," I muttered, planting myself beside the score like a devoted roadie. Fritz positioned himself precisely where Hallberg had stood during that final rehearsal. Wolfe gave a slight nod, and the silent symphony began. "Now," Wolfe said, "imagine Hallberg here, before the fermata, all is in motion, the baton rises." Fritz raised it like it weighed more than it should. "And then—" Wolfe paused. The baton froze mid-air. Every eye in the room was glued to it, except Lyle's. His gaze had dropped to the floor, then flicked to the door like it owed him money. Wolfe continued, voice low. A soundless moment. Suspense. Nothing moves, except... He let the rest hang like an unresolved chord. Lyle shifted again. Suspicion had started to hum in the room, and it wasn't in D major. "Silence," Wolfe said, "is a deceptive interval." He tapped the score gently. "This fermata, this final pause, is not a mere flourish. It is a tactical fulcrum." Ingrid scoffed softly. Lyle clenched his jaw so tight I half expected his molars to throw in the towel. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Victor Hallberg was murdered in the moment music ceased. Not because of silence, but because of what accompanied it. Inaudible music. Chester smirked. "That's poetic." "No," Wolfe said curtly. "Mechanical treachery. Hallberg's death was not coincidental. It was engineered. Timed." He turned to me. "Archie, the device." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the item Wolfe had stored in the desk drawer earlier. A modified tuning fork with a brass stem. Looked innocent enough, if you weren't conducting autopsies. Wolfe continued. "A soundless signal, ultrasonic, emanated from this device. rigged to Hallberg's music stand. It required precise timing. The fermata provided it. A held breath, during which he looked toward Lyle. The signal was triggered. Lyle didn't respond, but he didn't blink either. Wolfe leaned back. It was not a pause for effect. It was a countdown, a conductor's death disguised as rest. You could have heard a pin drop if it didn't vibrate itself to pieces. Wolfe turned the tuning fork gently in his fingers, like a priest handling sacred relics, or maybe cursed ones. "This fork," he said, "has been tampered with, modified to emit an ultrasonic frequency when struck. To the human ear, nothing. To certain technology, deadly." Denny blinked. "Wait, are you saying it made a noise only machines could hear?" "Not machines," Wolfe said. "Pacemakers." That put the silence out of business. Wolfe gestured toward the diagram Archie had tacked up earlier. Victor Hallberg had a pacemaker, an older model, sensitive to radio frequency interference. Ingrid's mouth parted, but no words came out. Chester's fingers tapped his knee like they'd been caught speeding. "During the final fermata," Wolfe said, "someone triggered this fork, perhaps struck against the stand's hidden brace. The resulting signal disrupted Hallberg's pacemaker, stopped it. He died not of tension, but precision." Lyle's lip twitched. Wolfe pointed gently. "The murder weapon, gentlemen, is not a blade or bullet, but this." He set the fork down like it had just confessed. The orchestra of suspects wasn't playing anymore, they were listening, and one of them knew the conductor had just been replaced. The room held its breath longer than the fermata ever had. Then, Lyle Dunn stood. Not suddenly, but like a tree that knew it was done with roots. "You son of a—" he began, then stopped himself. He didn't look at Wolfe. He looked at the floor, the tuning fork, his own hands. "It wasn't supposed to kill him," he muttered. "Just stop the concert." "You were quite successful," Wolfe said dryly. Lyle ran a hand through his hair, as if trying to comb out guilt. "He stole it, the whole piece, the silent note. It wasn't his, it was my grandfather's." "Lakatos," I said. "The recluse composer from Budapest. Died poor, unpublished, except apparently not unpublished." Lyle nodded. "He taught me rhythms before I could talk. I found the manuscript after he passed. Hallberg came sniffing around. Said he'd preserve it, give it voice, said we'd co-credit. Then he shut me out." "And so you silenced him," Wolfe said. Lyle sat again, suddenly boneless. "It was revenge, not murder." I looked at Wolfe. He looked at Lyle. "You will forgive me," Wolfe said, "if I decline to pass the difference." The baton had fallen, and Lyle knew his curtain call had just played. We weren't done. "Chester Bar," Wolfe said without turning his head. "Your turn." Chester leaned back. "I didn't kill Hallberg." "No," Wolfe agreed. "But you tried to sell his corpse a second act." I raised an eyebrow. "Blackmail." Wolfe nodded. Chester discovered Lyle's heritage, perhaps from a chat too long or a confession too loose. He offered silence, for a price. Chester scoffed. "Ridiculous." "Is it?" Wolfe asked. "Your bank account says otherwise. Large deposit, no source, a perfect pitch of opportunism." Lyle's fists curled. "You said it would end there," he hissed. "And it would have, if you'd paid on time," Chester shot back. I cleared my throat. "Except he didn't want installments. He wanted a crescendo, and Lyle gave it to him." Wolfe finished for me. "Dunn realized that one blackmailer leads to more. So he used the same trick. Fork, pulse, silence." Chester stood up, color draining. "You can't prove it," he barked. "No," Wolfe said. "But Kramer can." Chester looked at the door. I stepped in front of it. "Let's not add running to the list," I told him. "The acoustics in holding cells are terrible." Inspector Kramer arrived with a frown deep enough to qualify as seismic activity. Wolfe, unfazed, gestured to the tuning fork on the table. "Your murder weapon," he said. Do handle it carefully. It kills discreetly. Kramer picked it up with the corner of a handkerchief. You serious? As a stopped heart, Wolfe replied. I filled him in, while Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes, already bored of the wrap-up. Kramer grilled Lyle and Chester for 30 minutes, muttered something about needing aspirin, and then looked back at Wolfe. Hell of a method. I didn't argue. I'd seen him tuck away weirder things. But this one had teeth, and a tune you didn't hum twice. There's a kind of silence that creeps in after justice is served. The kind Wolfe likes best. No calls, no clients, no Kramer. Just the steady tick of the old desk clock and the occasional clink of glass when I refill his beer. He was deep in his armchair, orchids above, digestion below, when I picked up the score one last time. I didn't open it, just looked at the aged cover, the name Lakatos etched faintly like a whisper from the past. Then I slid it back into Wolfe's safe and spun the dial. Some killers use guns, some go for knives, poisons, ropes, or even a well-timed nudge. But this one... He waited for silence. The pause that doesn't show up on the sheet music. The breath between movements when hearts are supposed to keep beating. I flipped off the office light and called it a night. But before I hit the stairs, I glanced once more at the safe, tucked in the shadows. Some tunes should never be played again, and some silences aren't meant to be broken. A man died beneath the baton, not by bullet or blade, but by silence. A silence composed with malice, timed to perfection, and heard only by the one it was meant to break. In a world tuned to rhythm and harmony, it was the pause that killed, and the grief that lingered long after the last note faded. Justice, like music, requires interpretation. But some scores are better left unplayed. Do you believe revenge can ever be composed without dissonance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes. Efficiency, Inspector, Wolfe said. The killer had rhythm. Tragically, also motive. Kramer grunted. You know, one day I'd like a case with a nice clean gun. One day, Wolfe said, you may also wish for intelligent conversation in this city. I recommend against both. As they left, I slipped the fork into an evidence envelope. You don't forget a murder weapon like that. Back in the office, Wolfe reached for his beer. The orchids hummed their quiet approval. Not every silence is golden, I said. No, Wolfe murmured, but some are final. And with that, the note ended, not with a bang, but with perfect pitch. When the curtain fell on Lyle Dunn, it didn't come with applause. It came with the metallic snick of handcuffs and Kramer's bulldog growl of satisfaction. Lyle didn't resist, but he did manage to glare like a man who still thought he deserved a standing ovation. I was tempted to toss him a rose and whisper bravo, but Wolfe probably would have fired me on principle. Wolfe stayed rooted in his oversized throne, the Roman senator in his basilica. He didn't watch the arrest, didn't gloat, didn't even flinch, just closed his eyes for a moment, as if the entire sordid affair, murder by tuning fork, theft by bloodline, silence as a weapon, was merely another item crossed off a tedious agenda. Take him, Kramer barked to the uniforms. And somebody tell the lab I want that tuning fork dusted by sundown. I gave Wolfe a nod. Well, boss, we've bagged the baton basher. He opened one eye. If you're quite through with the vaudeville, Archie, I'd like my beer. And just like that, the concert was over. But the reviews were still to come. The next morning, I brought the Times to the breakfast table with a flourish worthy of a Broadway curtain call. Wolfe didn't lift his eyes from the coddled eggs Fritz had prepared with a reverence usually reserved for sacred rites. Front page, bottom corner, in the arts section, but it had its punch. Conductor slain in soundless score, maestro's death tied to forgotten composer. Below that, a smaller subhead. Detective's assistant CT's musical mayhem I cleared my throat. I seem to have made it into print. Wolfe reached for the salt. Twice, he said without looking. Both instances regrettable. They spelled my name right. An oversight, I'm sure. He sipped his coffee, grimaced, and pushed the paper aside as if the ink personally offended him. I let it go. I knew he hated the spotlight, unless it came with Latin epigrams and no reporters. But me, I don't mind a little fame, as long as it fits above the fold. That afternoon, Margareta Hallberg sat in Wolfe's office, her face as composed as the music that had cost her husband his life. She held the restored score delicately, like it might explode or sing. Wolfe regarded her with the courtesy he reserved for widows, titled nobility, and the occasional bottle of authentic Madeira. The work, he said, is yours by legal inheritance, but I would advise against its performance. Her brow creased. Even with the truth known. Wolfe folded his fingers over his girth. Truth is rarely an antiseptic. Art, madam, is capable of great beauty, but sometimes it becomes a vessel for secrets better left untuned. She nodded slowly. I'll keep it, but perhaps in a drawer. A very deep drawer. She left with grace and silence, and I watched the door close behind her. For once, I didn't have a wisecrack. Some endings aren't meant for words. Just the rustle of paper never turned to music again. Dinner that evening was duck à l'orange, Fritz's latest act of culinary brilliance. The sauce could have made a man renounce crime just to eat free in the brownstone. Wolfe, to no one's surprise, was already halfway through his portion, before offering a grunt of approval. I suppose you're happy, I said, carving a sliver off my own plate. Case closed. Killer caught. Music silenced. Melodramatic drivel, he declared, dabbing his lips with a napkin. The entire affair relied far too heavily on theatrical nonsense. Fermatas, pacemakers, ancestral grudges. Drivel. Sure, except that the drivel's now sitting in your safe. He gave me a look that would have frozen boiling consommé. I am not sentimental, Archie. I am cautious. That score represents a historical artifact entangled in homicidal mythology. It will remain undisturbed. So, it's a souvenir. A quarantine, he said, and reached for his beer. I didn't argue. I'd seen him tuck away weirder things. But this one had teeth, and a tune you didn't hum twice. There's a kind of silence that creeps in after justice is served. The kind Wolfe likes best. No calls, no clients, no Kramer. Just the steady tick of the old desk clock and the occasional clink of glass when I refill his beer. He was deep in his armchair, orchids above, digestion below, when I picked up the score one last time. I didn't open it, just looked at the aged cover, the name Lakatos etched faintly like a whisper from the past. Then I slid it back into Wolfe's safe and spun the dial. Some killers use guns. Some go for knives, poisons, ropes, or even a well-timed nudge. But this one, he waited for silence. The pause that doesn't show up on the sheet music. The breath between movements when hearts are supposed to keep beating. I flipped off the office light and called it a night. But before I hit the stairs, I glanced once more at the safe, tucked in the shadows. Some tunes should never be played again, and some silences aren't meant to be broken. A man died beneath the baton, not by bullet or blade, but by silence. A silence composed with malice, timed to perfection, and heard only by the one it was meant to break. In a world tuned to rhythm and harmony, it was the pause that killed, and the grief that lingered long after the last note faded. Justice, like music, requires interpretation. But some scores are better left unplayed. Do you believe revenge can ever be composed without dissonance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.